Welcome to the Conversations on Healing podcast, where host Shay Beider speaks with renowned healthcare leaders and practitioners to explore the world of wellness, the incredible powers of self-care, and what it truly means to heal today. Join us on this journey to become more whole, healed, and connected.
Hello, everyone. This is Shay Beider, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to my guest today, Dr. Jasleen Chhatwal. Dr. Chhatwal is a board-certified psychiatrist with experience treating complex mental health issues in inpatient, outpatient, and residential settings. She believes that each individual has a unique, authentic story and is grateful to all of the patients who have entrusted her with their stories. As the Chief Medical Officer at Sierra Tucson, which is a premier residential treatment center, Dr. Chhatwal has much to share in regards to healing and recovery. You'll also hear about what she learned personally practicing medicine in India, where she grew up, and learn a bit about her beautiful philosophy known as intentional evolution. I'm looking forward to having you join us for this enriching conversation. So I want to welcome you, Jasleen, and say how grateful I am to have you on the podcast today. I know you have a tremendous body of knowledge in the healing arts that will be very valuable for our listeners to have an opportunity to absorb. And I'm just delighted to begin our conversation. So welcome.
Thank you, Shay. I'm delighted to be here.
I want to sort of dive right into a question about your personal philosophy for healing and how you would define or describe that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think I've been developing and trying to develop, and I'm sure it's going to be an ever-evolving thing, that philosophy of healing. And as I look through the many stories that I've seen play out in my life and that of my patients, I've grown to believe that change is really the only constant thing in human life. So even take our current pandemic. A year ago, we couldn't have imagined that we would be having our day-to-day lives turned upside down. And now the only thing that we really can control in this time of chaos, essentially, is how we choose to react, how we choose to take this either within our stride or fight it. And so I feel like that really is what informs my personal philosophy of healing. I believe that each individual can take what is given to them in life and either take that as an opportunity to challenge oneself and transform, or just be transformed by it. And the way I try to guide my patients and try to live my life is with intention and using mindfulness to really start to steer our lives in a direction that we want to go in. And I call it intentional evolution. So essentially you have to evolve, and you can have a real strong voice and choice in how you evolve. And so I like to try and guide my patients, and I've really been practicing this in my own life over the last dozen or so years, where I try to choose what my direction in life will be when there are strange circumstances that come up or new things that I'm coming face to face with.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about, I love your wording, intentional evolution. That's really such a beautiful way to frame and phrase it. I like that a lot. So I want to talk about how you have worked with this philosophy or idea of intentional evolution with your patients, in your own life, within the community, whichever piece of that you want to tackle. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, and I think, that's where it gets really interesting. Like, I've been living this way for a while, but I only came up with the term or found the term that spoke to it in the last 6 or 8 months. And so prior to that, I remember, trying to work with my patients, attempting to reframe their perception of their life. And I started to look back at even how I live life. And I remember growing up with a lot of biases. Just every culture gives its burden of biases to us. So in the Indian culture, it was, you needed to be light-skinned to be somebody who was considered, I think, attractive or positive. And so if you were dark-skinned, you really got put aside. Or if you didn't, go into a certain type of field of study, then you were considered less than. There wasn't a lot of racial diversity, even though we had a lot of religious and other types of cultural diversity. So for myself, as I've come to the US now for almost 10 years, I've been working through and been exposed to a completely different culture. From my own personal life, I can say that I really had to intentionally evolve to become a part of a new culture, have an identity, and have a way to really speak to my passion, which is mental health. And so it's really been challenging those strongly held beliefs, which are often false. And that happens to each of us. Like we believe, I can't sing, I can't do this, I'm not a good cook. And so every single belief I've had about myself, I've really tried to tackle head on by saying, okay, well, let's test how true this is, or, how accurate your thought process is. So I feel like from my personal experience, that's really how I've started my journey. And I'd lost my father about a dozen years ago to suicide. And it was just the biggest loss I could ever have imagined. And my voice even cracks now as I talk about it, and that's really been a journey that I've been on since that time, having to really reframe my own life and find meaning and find purpose. And I feel like this piece of intentional evolution and really going after my own goals and starting to say, there's all these beliefs that can be limiting are beliefs that are held by myself. And so if I really want to change it, I have to look at my own beliefs. And I feel like when I work with patients, that's really my message to them. How much of what you're thinking about is really true? And how do you go and test it? So most of my patients, like when I used to do even longer term work, know that I'll be in their corner and I'm there to support them while they go have an adventure and they go and tackle things that they would never have thought they would tackle, so that they really can make their lives full and whole and just completely enjoyable.
Yeah. And I'm hearing in your story and in the way you're communicating it, how you've taken these challenges in your life, and there's been multiple challenges in your story and in your path, and you've taken those and you've found a way to allow that to create this intentional evolution. And I think it's such a gift, not only for yourself, but for the patients that you're serving, that you've had the courage to define your life in a way that's not only serving the self, but also serving others. So there's a real depth in your practice, undoubtedly, as a result of that commitment to both self and other. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Moment of acknowledgement.
Yeah. Well, that is really kind. I feel like that may not be how I would have thought of it. And I really, really appreciate you giving me that perspective. That's
absolutely.
Very kind.
Hardcore. It's
yeah.
tough to take the extraordinary challenges that we face in life and do something of meaning and value with them. That is an art. That is a high art, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think it's just kind of interesting how other people will view our lives, right? And we all take our lives just so seriously. Like I think about myself 7 or 6, 7, 8 years ago while I was in training. And I really was a very serious person. And I would think, oh my God, I left my country, I left my family. I'm exactly, interestingly, like 180 degrees across in the world. So where my hometown in India is, Tucson, Arizona is almost exactly halfway across the globe. And so I would think of that and I'd say, oh my God, I've done all of this. Now I just have to be super serious about my job. I got to learn everything. I got to do everything. So some of my colleagues in training would say, Jasleen's interested in everything. And Jasleen truly was. And there was this element of just taking myself way too seriously. And I really hope that over time, I'm able to find more humor, even in my supposedly very serious story.
Right. Exactly. Because there is humor and joy and lightness of being in all of it, right?
Yeah.
This is par for the course as well. And I love that, because sometimes we have to, I feel like that's when that witness sometimes can come in, or the observing self, where we can acknowledge and see and confirm that act of taking ourselves too seriously, and then enjoy the humor in it. Like that,
Yeah.
this is also kind of silly to take yourself too seriously.
Yeah, it's like,
we do it all the time.
yeah, I'm like, you're never going to get out of this alive. You can take it as seriously as you want.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
an option.
Yeah. And, working with just mental health, I feel like there is so much stigma, so much energy sometimes around it. Like people have very strong beliefs about mental health. And so it can be that, especially say for myself, my mom, when I was little, would call me like a little advocate. I was always socially advocating for something or the other. And so, there can be this element of constantly thinking about the wrongs that are happening in the world, and always just being bitter and angry and upset about that. Or I feel like now I'm trying more so to take an active voice and saying, well, while we're going to try and change the world, let's try and have some fun with it.
I love that. Yeah, because there's choice in all of it, right? There's choice in create, and this piece, like I always want I want an active creative process of defining the world in which we want to live. And that can be joyous and playful and fun, right? That idea of, yes, we want to create change in the world, and both the path to creating that change and the outcome that we want to create can be one that is full of so much excitement and playfulness. And even if it's creating big, heavy, hard things, you don't have to do that with a big, heavy, hard hand.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. So I think that's a very healthy reminder that you're kind of giving all of us to, even in the serious moments. And certainly we're in an extraordinarily serious moment as a world community right now. And yet it doesn't have to be defined by the hard and the heavy. And your story really, I think, illuminates that, and also how you work with patients too, that there's a choice there, like you said. And so I want to talk a little bit about Sierra Tucson, because there's people that come from all over the United States and also internationally to receive care at Sierra Tucson. And I really would like to hear a little bit about, in your role as the chief medical officer there, what you have learned about healing and ways to maybe create intentional evolution, and what you would like to share about your experiences at, a very premier facility.
Yeah. So Sierra Tucson is a really special place. And I would say that the facility and its people have given me a whole new perspective on trauma and healing. Like I always considered myself a trauma, I guess more trauma aware psychiatrist, which is what my training is, and always thought of, you need to grow in many kinds of ways. So when you pull up to the Sierra Tucson gate, there's a little sign that says, expect a miracle. It would be so easy to look at that sign with some cynicism and say, oh, what a great marketing strategy. However, now that I've been a part of that team for almost 2 years, I really do believe that you can expect a miracle on entering those gates. The people in the organization, I feel like their commitment to the patients or residents, as we call them when they come in, our clients, the ability to honor each person's story when they are on the premises, really makes it a very unique and special place. And I think we all in our team talk about how great it is to work with a team of like-minded individuals, everybody who's just so honored and involved in helping improve lives. It's also just the campus is an amazingly serene place. It's got all the beauty of the desert that you can imagine. And then, there's a little bit of wildlife. There's just so much going on that once you're there, it's hard to continue to carry the burden of the world. And so there is this lightness that the place brings, and the passion and overall dedication, I think, really makes it an ideal place to start the process of healing. And I think I say start because I do feel like healing is a lifelong process. I like to use the term wellness or health instead of illness most often, because it really is one of those things. It's not like if I had a condition, I get a little bit better, then I'm okay for the rest of my life. It just has to be a journey. And I feel like Sierra Tucson is that great place to start that journey, whether you come in as a resident or a client looking to get care, or even as a professional to work and really put your career on a path that makes it really fulfilling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I want to touch on, because you spoke to the beauty of how you're working with your colleagues there at Sierra Tucson and how much that feels right and good. And I want to talk a little bit about the interdisciplinary team that you work with on a daily basis and kind of who comprises that, so that people have an understanding, because it's quite unique.
Yeah. So it's a team that I feel like even after having been there 2 years, I continue to find new little gems. But the people that would maybe be the core part of anybody's team or my team when I work day to day is definitely psychiatrists, which are, physicians who are trained in psychiatry. We also have addiction medicine physicians. We have a pain physician who works with us. We have other doctors and physician's assistants who take care of physical health. We have a couple of naturopathic doctors. So those are physicians who are trained in holistic medicine typically. Then we have body workers who do massage, acupuncture, shiatsu, just a whole range of integrative body-based treatments. And then another huge part of our team, which is probably the largest part of our team, is a whole slew of therapists. And they're all the way from clinical psychologists who do testing and, kind of figure out personality, diagnostics, other things, to also having therapists who do sexual addiction work, who do primary trauma work, who do work in complicated mood disorders. And then we have another team of people who do biofeedback and physical therapy and physical rehabilitation through personal training. And so it's just like the list goes on, and it's so beautiful to have so many different ways to approach healing. And so I think that's really the joy of the work, that, an equine therapist and a biofeedback practitioner and somebody like me who's medically trained will all come at healing in slightly different ways. So what this team has taught me is that you can not only have so many ways in your life that you can have trauma, but there are even more ways that you can approach healing. And I feel like for me, that's a really positive and hopeful message.
I love that. I want to pause because that's really profound, that there's more paths to healing even than there are to trauma. I think just for people to hear that and take that in is so powerful. It's a very powerful statement. And I would agree with you. It's a very true statement too.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one of those things where we all get very stuck in like, oh, if I have XYZ condition or I'm struggling with this, I have to go to a therapist. Yes, you might. And you may also heal when you go to a singing teacher and break down a barrier you had about not being able to sing. because you just suddenly expanded your horizons. So you can expand your horizons and heal and grow in so many ways, which is why I'm really excited that like expressive arts are now becoming a bigger part of mental health and healing. And it's just such a beautiful world right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I want to get a little bit into your early story. You mentioned that you grew up in India, and I'm very curious to learn more about kind of what you understood about medicine growing up in India, because obviously there's different philosophies of medicine there. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that from your perspective.
Yeah, India is a mystical land. And so when growing up in India, my background is that both my parents actually went to medical school and were physicians. But they were only physicians by training. My dad trained to be a surgeon. My mom did, basic medicine initially, then she got into public health. But in the end, both of them ended up not doing clinical medicine. And essentially, my dad worked for our state and national government, heading up really big departments and, being almost like, I guess the equivalent in the US would be something like being in the State Department and running a lot of different areas and such for the government. My mom would run these public health programs. And so what I really knew about health from them was more large scale public health measures. Like, what are the ways to do prevention and take care of people and provide them resources? But then they had this slew of friends from being in medical school who were actual clinical physicians, and I would see them, seeing their patients. They had their own clinics. They couldn't quite go on vacation. So I would say, oh, I don't really want to be a doctor. It seems like a really burdensome profession. Like, you can't even go on vacation. And so I think as I started to grow up in India, I would see all the traditional ways of healing. There's prayer, there's yoga, there'd be my uncle who was an Ayurvedic doctor. However, the other pieces that I noticed was that, our so-called educated class, we would undermine the importance sometimes of our Eastern medicine, our traditional medicine, and think that the physicians who were trained in more Western style medical schools were the better doctors. And so those were the doctors you went to. And so for me, coming to the US and now going down this path of having done an integrative medicine fellowship and practicing so integratively, seems to be like life has come full circle. And in recent years, when I've gone back to India, I feel like I've been able to see my country and its richness with an even wider lens. And I'm so grateful that I do, because I feel like otherwise almost like half of that medicine would be lost on me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think I learned in India all those things. And now when I read them through the lens of evidence-based integrative medicine, I'm like, oh, I already knew that. Saffron? Oh yeah, I used to use it. I would drink it in milk as a child. So even though maybe in the country we had started to undermine some of those traditional systems, we had those so closely interwoven in our lives that, turmeric, we were all using that in our food. We're using the spices, we're having less processed foods, all the good things that we now sit and say, oh my God, we have this research. I felt like we were doing to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you mentioned that both your parents were physicians, and why do you think, even though you knew like, ooh, physician, that could be hard, you don't get to go on vacation, like that's a tough job. Why do you think you still ended up making that decision for yourself? Why did you choose to become a doctor?
Yeah, thank you for redirecting me. I think I went off on a little tangent last time. So the part of the reason I finally decided to go into medicine is that I ran through a lot of different choices. I was the kid who one month wanted to become a pilot, another month wanted to be an attorney. Like, I ran through many, many choices in my life. And then finally, I remember, going to different hospitals just because loved ones were there or something, and realizing that medicine was the one profession in which I felt I wouldn't have to pick sides, like whether somebody was a good person or not, which is, kind of like that naive 15-year-old mind thinking like you're either good or you're not. I was like, well, no matter what kind of person, they still need healthcare. And so that is where I decided finally as a 15-year-old, I was like, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. And there's going to be a lot of studying involved. And in India, we can go to medical school right after high school. So thankfully, I didn't have a whole lot of time to flip-flop back again into different choices. And so I went to school to medical school as a 17-year-old. And I haven't looked back since. There hasn't been a day that I've regretted that decision. And I feel like just the interaction with patients and being able to do things to help others in my day-to-day life has been just such a powerful motivator that has kept me very grounded and in medicine.
And I'd like to know that advocate that was always there in you as a child, that your mom saw in you, and that how did that stay alive for you in medicine? How were you able to hold on to that side of yourself that was so primary?
I think there's many different ways that has been able to be nourished. I feel like definitely when I was in medical school, we're fairly idealistic. And so it was always asking for clarity on why patients were getting certain kinds of treatments, trying to support their families. So if that meant taking some extra time to explain to them after the rest of the team left what the doctor was trying to say in simpler terms so that they could understand. But now in my practice, I'm fairly active in what is called organized medicine, which is being part of state or national societies that advocate for physicians, patients, etc. And so I'm pretty active in the Arizona Psychiatric Society and then also in the American Psychiatric Association. So these are organizations of psychiatrists who basically, work on legislative processes or also other kinds of social advocacy for not only our profession, but also our patients. So that's really the way that I've kept that going on a larger scale. And then I feel like day to day in my job or in all our roles as clinicians in some way or the other, we're advocating for our patients to get the right types of treatment, access the right types of care. Here in the US, there's such a huge involvement of insurance. So it's also advocating with insurance for them to, get approved certain types of treatment. And then with my team, I always feel like being an advocate is a huge part of my role to make sure that their day-to-day work and lives feel fulfilling. We all talk about that work-life balance and such. I maybe don't believe fully in the work-life balance wording, since I think like with medicine, there's not really that 9 to 5 structure. However, I do believe that there has to be enough joy in work and enough time away from work to recuperate that you're able to come back with all of yourself and the fullness of your spirit to help somebody else get to their wholeness and their fullness of spirit.
That's right. A whole self meeting a whole self is so important, right? And I love that piece. I'm so fascinated by that piece actually, because I think we see this so often in the way we perceive patients in their brokenness, right? We have these ideas of brokenness and we can all be broken at times. And I find exactly the opposite in my own real life experience, like boots on the ground. I think it's all about wholeness. It's about seeing the wholeness in that other human being and then also resonating with the wholeness in your own being. That is what really allows the next kind of moment of evolutionary change, right? Kind of that uplift into the next space. And so that's a whole conversation in and of itself.
Yeah.
That's a big topic.
Yeah. So I think, that point is really well made. Like, it's really not the brokenness of people. It's the brokenness of the healthcare system. And so even when we hear about the evolution of medicine, there used to be a time that we would consider the mind, body, spirit all interconnected. And then there was this split that was made to say mind can be left to the church and body will be given to medicine. And so that's when that mind-body duality came about, is when we've sort of started slipping away from our real cultures and our roots and such. And so that's really partly the issue right now, that we're so siloed off. Everybody's a specialist and doesn't know about what else is happening somewhere else. And it's almost like we consider ourselves better because we're more specialized. And what that really takes away is, it takes away the whole person. It makes you a liver that's bad or a brain that's got something going on. But, where's Shay in the middle of all of that?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying as a patient perspective. Where's Shay?
Yeah.
Right? Like, and that part of me that like wants to advocate for the patient, it's just like that piece wants to say holism, right? Holism is so critical, and not in any way to disregard the extraordinary value of specialties, because that's a really interesting part and a beautiful part of medicine. But it, to me, all has to move under a much larger, more comprehensive bird's eye view that is holistic, that sees all the interconnecting parts. And, in my personal philosophy, where that really rests, where the knowledge of the holism rests, is in the patient themselves.
Mm-hmm.
In the patient themselves, that they can tell you how it all comes together and where the connections live. So I feel like the more we drive towards really patient-centered medicine and a form of deep listening that allows the story that's at the center of that individual human's experience of illness and health, the more we hear that and customize a care plan around that, the closer we get to really high quality care, really high quality care.
Yeah. And I think like that's where you're really right. What else is there if we're not going to be able to honor the person? Like, why are we going to work every day if we're going to forget the person who's at the center of it all? And it's really uplifting, right, to see that movement even within the physician community. Like, there is so much conversation about that. And there is this whole talk about physicians taking back medicine. And that's really to take it back from organizations that tell you do checklists, or having you sort of stuck with sitting there in front of your computer and typing all day. That's really the one part of medicine in India that I miss. So I used to be a physician in India prior to moving here. I completed my medical school, got a license. And partly the reason for me working there was because I'd lost my dad around the same time that I was finishing medical school. So I wanted to be with my mom. But I could see, a whole slew of patients in an evening and sit down with them and actually speak with them. And we would do these like handwritten notes that we would basically give to the patient. So we would keep kind of what used to be called a carbon copy. I don't know if a lot of people listening even remember what that was, but we would have these notepads which had like the little blue, carbon sheet in the middle. And so you would write out your prescription and some instructions on the sheet for the patient, and you'd keep that like second copy and give them the original. And the patient got to keep it. So it was their responsibility essentially to bring it back. So a little bit of responsibility for the patient to have ownership in their care. And then also on the other hand, me actually getting to just sit there with them and their family and speak with them, rather than having to enter a whole slew of things into the computer and check mark and do all of that. And so sometimes I miss that. I miss that a lot. I miss, just being able to reduce the burden of documenting a whole lot and being able to sit with the patient. I recognize the importance of documentation. So in my mind, like, I'm really constantly trying to figure out, how do I get to a place where the two can be balanced? And thankfully, in my current work, I feel like it's much better than it used to be in prior roles that I've been in, where at Sierra Tucson, we have a slightly different way of billing, and we've been able to do a little bit more of that, but it's still just a lot of technology interface rather than human interface. And I'm grateful that in psychiatry, it's all about the human being, so nobody can really take that time away from us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember reading a very interesting research study where they looked at, on average, physicians interrupted their patients after 15 seconds. So when a patient came into the office and they wanted to tell you, like, this is what's wrong, this is the issue, it was 15 seconds on average when they would be interrupted. And then a doctor who I heard talking about this said they did an experiment to see if the physician didn't interrupt, how long would the patient carry on average. And it ended up only being that it was 90 seconds. So it's really not that much more time. And so this doctor was saying, all we have to do is just be patient and learn, to sit with that story for just a little bit longer, because if we do, it's really not that much time in the grand scheme of things. And I think, obviously, it goes without saying, there's whole systems design flaws here that have to be, reorganized and restructured to allow physicians to take that 90 seconds or whatever is needed. So it's not in any way to minimize the systemic issues, which are very real, that put a lot of pressure on doctors to move fast. But it was fascinating to me that it really wasn't an extraordinary quantity of time. It was, and yet they felt, the patients who reported qualitatively said they felt so much better being able to be heard. To feel heard is so valuable when you're not feeling well, when you're sick. And so I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a question about, you mentioned your father's suicide, and you work in the field of mental health. And I want to understand, to whatever degree feels appropriate to you to share, how that experience helped to change and transform your understanding of both what it means to struggle with mental illness or challenge or adversity, and also what it means to heal because of the experience you inevitably had to, go through on the other side of that tragic loss. So any piece of that you would like to share, I think, could be quite important.
Yeah. So I think I was 22 when I lost my dad. I was just finishing medical school, like I had shared earlier. And interestingly, I hadn't learned a lot about mental health. I had only known about 6 months prior to that, when I moved back home. In India, the year of internship is part of medical school. So that's what I was doing back home. And as I was working through many different specialties, I remember having my mental health or psychiatry rotation, and that didn't really give me much of a feeling for what was going on. It's like, it was 2 weeks, it came and it went, and that was it. And as I learned about my dad having bipolar disorder from my mom, I didn't really know what to do with it. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's why he snapped at me yesterday. Okay, he's irritable right now. Fine, I won't piss him off more, as a 22-year-old. And then a few months later, he had developed a depressive episode. We were, having a lot of changes in our lives and such, in our personal lives. And as he passed, I was just really grateful to know that this was something he was struggling with. Because had I not known, I wouldn't have had a way to make sense of it, because it's just such a profound loss. And my dad had so much stigma about having bipolar disorder that I can count on one hand the number of people who knew that he was struggling. So there was my mom, a mentor of his, one friend, and then, maybe like the three doctors he'd seen in his lifetime. He had been going to a physician pretty regularly. And so he was getting treatment, he was doing all of that, but he never really sought the support of more people. And the reason was that he knew in his role being a public figure in India that if somebody knew that he had a mental health issue, the only words they would equate would be the equivalent of mad or crazy, because there just wasn't a greater concept for mental health. And so I think after his passing, that became so evident to me in conversations I would have with people. We had family members who came to his funeral. Like we had, I think, over 3,000 people at his funeral. And there was just this massive outpouring of sadness in our community. And I remember some people coming up to my mom and me and saying, "Oh, we didn't know Uncle was crazy." And we're both just so taken aback that, first of all, you're using that word, you're saying that to us at such a time. And then that is when I was finishing my internship. And then as I started working in India, it became really evident to me that people would not go see a psychiatrist. There wasn't really a true concept of therapist in our community. And we're a large city, like the place I come from. It's called Chandigarh. It's the state capital, or the capital of two different states. It has, 2 or 3 of the best medical schools, all of that, but just people in our community had just no concept. And I would work in OB-GYN, so, seeing women with their health issues. And then later on, I worked at an emergency room in that same, it's kind of like a county hospital. And when I would see people who would be struggling with mental duress, I would refer them to the psychiatrist, and they would just come right back to me. Because I was taking time while I was doing the prenatal exams to ask women about domestic violence. How are people treating you in the house? What kind of food are you getting? Or in the emergency room, I would get patients who were really anxious and having these, what we call psychosomatic symptoms. So that's mental distress that manifests as a physical symptom. So women would come who couldn't speak, guys who said, "Oh, my leg is not working," or something like that, after just sort of an acute mentally distressing event. And so I think over time, as I did that and I was preparing to come to the US and I started reading, I thought and believed that maybe I had some aptitude for this work. But I was so scared after having lost my dad to suicide, worrying that, am I making this decision because I lost my dad? Like, is this just one of those like passionate decisions you make, but then later on it ends up costing you your own life? Like, you're so distressed and you're so disturbed because you're bringing those stories home with you. That as I came to the US and started doing some clinical rotations, which are required to come, get some reference letters and such to come into residency here, that I started to look for psychiatry rotations that I could do. So places where I could work with mental health so that I could start to assess how much of this is really me wanting to do this work because I want to work towards the stigma, and how much of this is me trying to correct my own life story and getting sucked in a little too deep. And so as I did that work, I worked with a psychiatrist in California who is just the most amazing and compassionate woman. Dr. Chan, I worked with her for a month. Then I got an opportunity at the University of Louisville in Kentucky to work for 4 months in the Department of Psychiatry. And so as I worked with many physicians in that place as well, I started to realize that it really was my calling, and that I was developing skills and ways to be really present with my patients, but then being able to go home and, essentially not associate those patients with my dad. And I think what really enabled me, I believe, to do that is that my relationship with my father was so deep and special that nobody else can really equate. And so I feel really blessed now that I have been doing work, some form of work in mental health for many years, that I have been able to continue to be that advocate and, bring all of that and all of the passion to mental health, and not really losing myself in the midst of it all. I am thankful that I am now being able to be a voice in reducing stigma. So recently I've started to be a little bit more vocal on social media. So that's something I'm still experimenting with. Social media is hard.
It is. It's a wild west out there.
Yeah. And it's just hard to know how much to put out and not. So
Yeah.
I'm really kind of studying and looking at, and I know that social media is a great way to put your voice out there and, help people understand certain concepts that may be new or different for them. But that's really the hope and the plan, hopefully, in the long run, that losing my dad to suicide means that there are going to be a lot of other dads and brothers and sisters and mothers and friends who will somehow get a positive impact. And I hope wherever he is, and I believe he's always watching down on me, that he will see that I've managed to do something positive with that, with the loss of him.
Yeah, it feels like, just in hearing your story kind of emerge, that it's like you've somehow managed to bring your whole self into your work and what you're creating in the world. And, it's like it appears to me that you didn't leave out any part of your story. And that can be a very, very challenging thing to do, that requires kind of a high bar to be able to bring all aspects of your life and, carry a diverse, I'm like holding it. I want my hands, people can't see, but it's like, I almost feel in my body, it's like you're holding all of this and moving it forward with all of your story. And just to be able to do that is really exceptional. So, just acknowledging your ability to carry all these different aspects of your journey and weave it all together into your work and life now is really something. And I think it sounds to me like you made a very excellent choice. Probably a very difficult one at the time, but but a very, very good choice.
Yeah, it feels right. And I think it wouldn't have been possible without, all the wonderful people. Like, we talk about community, and really without community, life is nothing. So not without my mom, so many of my friends, my husband, who I think when he met me, we were in training together. Like, I wasn't my whole self. I was still very much stuck with the brokenness and trying to figure it out. And I think it's always going to be a process. But just all these people who've been such a huge part of the journey. And I hope many more will join in, and it's going to be fabulous either way.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. You touched on this earlier, but I like to ask each of our guests how they would define healing. And so I want to put that question to you. How would you define healing?
Healing for me is really being able to be that ever evolving and whole person, where we are really able to consider this a journey, which is not about the destination. It's really the process of continuing to work through things on a day-to-day basis there's nothing called perfection. There's nothing called the end. And it's all just an ever-evolving journey. And I think that's where I go with the word healing.
I love that. Yeah. It's interesting because as I'm having these conversations, I'm learning so much. And this word process has come up over and over again in the answer to this question. How would you define healing? It's a process. So many people have woven that word in somehow. And it's just really reminding me how truthful that is about what it means to heal. That it's not a single action, it's a series of things. It's a series of actions and choices and intentions, and that all of that comes together. And also this idea, which you also caught and captured, this notion of that it's unending, right? That it's a continuation, it's a continuum. And I guess, at what point does that end? Possibly never. Maybe it just goes on and on until we take our last breath. And then who knows, maybe even beyond there, who knows?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like we talk about generational trauma, right? Or you talk about cultural trauma and such. It's the same thing with healing, like whatever your parents or your community taught you about healing, what examples they set, even after people are gone, you sort of carry that seed forward. So it is that, just like you said, it's always going to be a process, and it has to be interwoven in our lives. We can never say, oh, well, now I'm going to stop healing. Thank you very much.
That's right. We've somehow reached that mythical place.
Yeah.
What role has resilience taken in your understanding of trauma and what it means to heal? I'm interested because you work with so many individuals who have experienced extraordinary trauma, and many who also have a capacity for great resilience, even in the face of extraordinary trauma. So I'm curious about what you've learned about resilience and trauma and the relationship between the two.
Yeah. Resilience is just so attached to trauma in my mind that there really can't be resilience without trauma, or trauma without resilience in some way. And both are so deeply a part of human nature. And so when we start thinking about resilience, I think about just everything from, when you're born, like how you come through the birth passage, just even surviving that little journey, that's quite a miracle right there.
Indeed.
And then, for human babies, we're the most helpless creatures when we're born. And so to some degree, each of those tasks requires a degree of resilience. The fact that we make it to adulthood is just such a miracle itself, given all the things that can happen along the way. And I believe that everybody needs to have faced some kind of challenge. They don't have to be kind of those massive challenges like losing a parent or loved one, or, being in an accident. But we all need some small challenges and some small traumas to start building the muscle of resilience. And even though there are some genetic factors that we know can play into resilience, and temperamental, which are, again, things that we often think we're born with, but it is still very much, I believe, a muscle that you can grow and, increase your capacity for resilience. And sometimes I feel like the people who face the most trauma can end up being the most resilient too. So earlier this year, my husband, who's also a psychiatrist, and we both went to the Democratic Republic of Congo to work with a World Bank team with the victims of sexual violence and gender-based violence. And as we were going through these two big cities that we went to, which were the hubs and certain satellite clinics around, it was just so beautiful to see how these women and men who have faced years of violence in the form of, physical atrocities, kidnapping, sexual trauma, not really having access to resources, just the worst of what humankind can do to each other, would be there singing and dancing. Like that's how they would welcome us when we would come. And, they had bright smiles and just beautiful, bright eyes, and that they could find that joy in seeing us come to hear their stories or be with them and share in their in their history. And so I just feel like sometimes resilience is baffling to me. And it's also just the most beautiful thing, because we as humankind can take so much. And based on the perspective that we take and the intention that we bring, we can really shine in spite of or because of all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. I remember a Holocaust survivor, this woman, she told this beautiful story. And this was in the latter part of her life, many, many years after being in one of the camps. And she said, someone asked her about, like, how are you so resilient? Because she'd survived not only that, but many other big losses in her life. And
Yeah.
it was just like one of those lives where you think, how did this human being do this? Right. And her answer, I thought, was so cool. She said, I'm like an Indian rubber ball, which are these really hard, like strong rubber balls. And she said, the harder you throw me against the concrete, the higher I bounce.
Yeah.
And I was like, yes, 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 girl. Like that's some serious skill there.
Yeah.
She found a way. It was like the more life kind of pressed on her, she somehow found a way to convert that into a rise.
The bounce back. Yeah.
Right. And it's like, woo, that is impressive skill.
Yeah. I think for all your listeners, I would really recommend watching. There's one documentary on, well, I guess it's not fully a documentary, but it's a Netflix movie or it is a documentary. Oh God, I'm just getting stuck in the word, but it's called City of Joy. So that was one of the places we visited in the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the girl who's the protagonist in that movie in Netflix, or she's the one who kind of recurs the most. We actually got to meet her when we went. And she has just been through so much. And it's kind of like the lady the Holocaust survivor whose story you're sharing. She would enter, and this was pre-COVID. So she entered the room and she was just so overjoyed to meet us. And we exchanged hugs, and she's holding my hand and showing us around the campus and showing us what they do. That to some degree, when I came back after having visited City of Joy and watched that movie, I just sat there and cried like most of the time, because I couldn't imagine that this woman that I had just met a week or two ago had been through just so much. And I think that's just so stayed with me, that really joyous person who, has been able to do that in spite of, or just everything that she had been through. And it's that part of human beings, and that ability to take our life in the direction that we want to some degree, is just astounding.
It is. It's astounding. It's astounding and precious. And I want to say because I want to hold all sides of this conversation. And so I want to say, and we want to change all the systemic things that create that suffering that is unnecessary in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So it's like a holding and honoring of all of it, that there will always be inevitabilities in life which we cannot control, nor do we need to or want to. It's just a part of being a human being. And for those, we want extraordinary resilience, right? We want to learn that, we want to grow it, and we want to change all of the systems that create unnecessary suffering. And so both things can be true, right?
Yeah.
It's like we can build resilience and we can change systems, and like all of that can happen.
Yeah. And it's just so important that we all take our own share of work in that. So whether that's, how we, like, when somebody's listening to this conversation, I don't want them to be overwhelmed with like, oh crap, now I got to go to DRC and go work with these people, and I got to start a podcast or do something just outrageous there in the world. It's like how we raise our children, how do you tell them or teach them that there will be inevitable challenges and give them the skills to face those? So if there's a bully in school, like how do we help them navigate that situation? How do we let them know that we're going to be their safety net while they go address this overwhelming challenge in their life? Because that is an overwhelming challenge for a child. Or whether this is going out into your community and, giving a donation or helping a small cause or whatever you can do, like every little bit is needed and counts. Not everybody needs to fly across the world to go help people in war-torn areas, but there will be people who need to do that. And I hope governments around the world start to take notice that we are just all one people. And as much as we draw lines and do whatever, like at the end of the day, all of humankind has the same needs. Mm-hmm. And it's a need to be loved. It's a need to have basic requirements of food and shelter and water met. Like those are just the only things that really truly matter. And then our relationships, because when we're on our deathbeds, we're not going to think about how many diamond rings we had or what size our house was. Like we're going to think about the relationships we had and, were we comfortable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My daughter reminded me of those simple acts, right? That it doesn't have to be extraordinary. In that we were on a flight together several months ago now, and there was a woman who sat next to us on the airplane, and we spent quite a bit of time talking to that woman, and she made a very deep impression on my daughter, and we'll never see her again. We don't have her contact info. Yeah. We have no idea how to reach her or even what, who she is, really. But my daughter said to me, I'll never forget her. I will never forget her. And all that woman did was have a conversation with us on an airplane. And my daughter will never forget her. So it's so true that it's often in just simple acts of kindness or communication. We have great transformative capacity, and that can take many forms. It can be flying across the world, but it doesn't have to be either. It can be just sitting and talking to someone. So
thank you for sitting and talking to me today.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time to have this conversation and to lend so much to it. Kind of in closing, are there any other words that you would like to share with our audience, or any other experiences or understandings of healing, both personal or professional?
I think just as a final parting message, I'd like to say that, we all are the most important people in our individual lives. And some may call it selfishness. Somebody may say, you're narcissistic. But it really is that unless you can love yourself, and unless you decide that you're going to heal yourself, you're really no good to anybody else. So I hope that each of the people who listen to this at some point will take the time in their day to care for themselves and make sure that they're the person that they're healing first before they go out and start healing the world.
Very, very good recommendation. I love that. Well, thank you so much again for joining us in this lovely conversation on healing. And I appreciate you and the work you're doing in the world.
Thank you, Shay. I appreciate you, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Conversations on Healing podcast. If you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. It helps so you won't miss an episode. See you next time.